Anyway, let's move on to our program. We're very excited this morning. We have Mark Haveman, Executive Director of the Minnesota Center for Fiscal Excellence, joining us. Mark joined the organization in 2002 and took over the organization's leadership role in 2008. He is the author of numerous research and education publications on state and local tax policy and government finance. Mark was a member of Governor Palente's 21st Century Tax Reform Commission, served 4 years on the Board of Trustees of the Governmental Research Association, and has served on policy and project advisory boards for the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, as well as for several state agencies, academic institutions, and private foundations. He received his BA from Calvin College and an MBA from the University of Michigan. Big game this weekend with Penn State. Please join me in welcoming Mark Haveman.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and share with you some of our work on a topic that obviously gets a lot of attention in the past and is likely to continue to get a lot of attention in the future. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Minnesota Center for Fiscal Excellence, you're excused. We've only been in existence for about 8 months. However, 87 years prior to that, we were the Minnesota Taxpayers Association. Our mission is still the same as it always has been: sound tax policy, efficient spending, and accountable government. As a rule of thumb, we don't get involved in levels of taxation and spending, believing that that is the role of elected officials and citizens to determine how much government they want and want to support with their tax dollars. But what our organization is about is making sure that the revenue systems that support that spending adhere to good principles of tax policy, and that the spending that's done is transparent, efficient, accountable, and accomplishes what it's supposed to accomplish. I'd like to introduce this presentation by having everyone recall the old Miller Lite commercials with the sports jocks, where everybody agreed that Miller Lite was a fantastic beer, but you had the less filling camp, you had the taste great camp, and over the course of the 30 seconds, the argument would go from collegial to an all-out brawl. And in some respects, it seems like that's how this discussion of state competitiveness is evolving or has evolved. Everyone wants the best for the state of Minnesota with respect to economic growth and jobs, and the path to get there is often a source of significant debate. You have a strong group of people who believe that the business tax and cost climate should be the focus of our policy work. You have another group of people that believe strongly that investments in workforce, in infrastructure, in those sort of core elements of our economy that provide the foundation for productivity growth are essential. And essentially what this report attempted to do is look at the evidence to sort of see where we are in this balancing act. Our state economist, or former state economist now, Tom Stinson, has always been asked about this in legislative hearings. And he has described it as Minnesota's fiscal catch-22. If you overtax, you run significant risks of creating a hostile business climate that reduces investment in the state of Minnesota. If you do not invest appropriately in the things that make our economy great with respect to the infrastructure, both workforce and physical, you also run a risk of undercutting our performance. And he had no answers, except that if he knew the answer, he wouldn't be state economist. He'd be making a lot more money than he was making at the time. But our analysis looked at 10 studies that are out there, and it's based on a methodological framework done by one of the leading researchers in competitiveness studies, Michael Porter. He may be a name familiar with you. He runs the Institute for Competitive Studies at Harvard University. He has done 30 years worth of work looking at state and national and international competitiveness issues. And to distill all his work into two ideas, the basic framework for competitiveness, in his opinion, is you get two sides of the same coin. You have what he calls foundational competitiveness, which are sort of those workforce, physical infrastructure, and all those sort of micro and macroeconomic factors that just are essential to having a productive workforce and a productive economy. So the baseline foundational stuff on which an economy can grow and build. All that comes with a price tag, obviously, and that's where the other dimension, the investment attractiveness, comes in. For a given level of foundational competitiveness, there is going to be tax prices associated with those sorts of things. And determining the business tax and cost climate is the investive attractiveness. So you've got sort of you've got the foundational issues and the price tag for those foundational advantages. Coincidentally, the studies that we review sort of fall into each of those camps. Next slide, please. And I won't go through the list of what we looked at, but I do want to draw your attention to one thing that's not on this list. And the timing is excellent on this because the 2014 version just came out, and that's the National Tax Foundation's State Business Climate Study. Once again, Minnesota, as we have for year after year after year, is in the bottom 5 or bottom 10. I think we're now 47th in the nation, according to that investigation. What they attempt to do is take model principles of good tax policy and evaluate state tax systems based on those principles and argue that that is sort of the key to a positive business climate, adhering to good tax policy. It's a very legitimate thing to attempt to try to do, but measuring performance on the base of abstract ideas and principles inevitably gets you into issues of weighting and subjectivity and value judgments and things of that nature. So what we want to do is look specifically at those studies that actually attempted to measure business cost, either aggregate tax cost or marginal tax cost that is associated with new investment for different types of facilities and different types of manufacturing or service operations. And so the list of investment competitiveness studies on the right side all have a strong numerical modeling orientation to them, and it's the basis for our conclusions and recommendations. The good news is that Minnesota still remains very strong in the issues of foundational competitiveness. We generate truly enviable performance rankings across nearly all the areas of state competitiveness, foundational competitiveness. Consistent top 10 rankings in workforce education, composition, and deployment. One of the studies we looked at had 8 separate metrics for workforce-related issues. Minnesota's in the top 10 in 6 of them. Also, excellent rankings in state innovation capacity. How able are we, or ready are we meet to sort of address the global challenges of international commerce? Very high scores in patents, venture capital, industry research and development, things of that nature. We're also among the national leaders in transforming to the digital economy. IT adoption across most sectors of the state economy is very high, including government, which is fantastic news. Our public goods and quality of life remains extraordinary. Continued high rankings on environmental outcomes, security, public safety, infrastructure, that remains strong. Infrastructure is a little challenging because some of the metrics we look at are based on percentage of roads in poor condition. So maybe the best way to say it is we're less decrepit maybe than a lot of other states rather than achieving excellence, but the point is, relatively speaking, we do very well on those infrastructure-related issues. If there is one area for potential improvement that came out of the study, it's in the area of higher education. Affordability, we're 29th. Average college debt, 36th. Non-industry R&D, 38th. And higher education system efficiency, which is measured as spending per degree conferred in public institutions, 47th in the nation. So it seems like we do have some potential work to do there with respect to higher education. More good news. Very little evidence of any state slippage over the past, at least the past 10 years. One of the studies that we looked at was the ITIF New Economy. Our current rank is 13th. Our lowest rank was 14th. Our highest rank ever was 11th. So we remain in a steady state there. Beacon Hill State Competitiveness. We're at when the study that we looked at, we were 4th, which is the highest we've ever been. Our lowest rank was 2006, 9th. We retain strong, is there any chance? Okay. This goes a lot better when you can look at the numbers. We retain strong comparative advantage over our regional competitors, including the states around us. I'm going to pause a second here, let it catch up. There we go. Excellent. The ITIF rankings sort of focus on positioning for the global economy, for the digital economy. And you can see there that Minnesota scores very well. Beacon Hill has a stronger public good emphasis. And what struck us is that in some respects it seems like states have to choose one or the other, because you'll see there with our regional states, most states either score very well on one and not so well on the other, but Minnesota accomplishes both very well. And that's another very good sign. Moving to investment attractiveness findings. The results were a little bit more variable here. Some differences of opinion, but I think we capture it by saying we have pockets of comparative advantage in a generally more challenging business tax and cost climate. Again, there's some good news here. The tax environment here in the state of Minnesota remains actually quite strong and competitive with respect to high value-added capital-intensive manufacturing. And a lot of that has to do with smart tax policies that we've had in place for a very long time, not taxing personal property of manufacturing operations, moving to single sales factor apportionment, and a number of those more technical details associated with the corporate and property tax that has paid off for us and is reflected in our rankings. The differences that you do see here, I think, are largely influenced by whether or not the studies include the individual income tax in their study of business competitiveness. The Council of State Taxation in Washington, D.C. places us 13th in the nation overall with respect to taxation of new business investment, which is very good. That is specifically for C Corps. Moody's, which takes a more broader encompassing look at the universe of taxes, including individual income tax, has us 39th. And I'll be talking a little bit more about the individual income tax and its role in competitiveness a little later on. Business-to-business concerns, I think, are very understandable based on what we sort of uncovered through the course of this investigation. As you see there, support and research operations pay more in sales tax as a share of total tax burden than any other facilities and have the highest tax rates on new investment. At the same time, business services represent the second largest source of job creation in the state of Minnesota. So, putting politics aside, I think you can understand why there has been so much concern about this, because you put those two things together, this is a pretty significant shot directly at the heart of the Minnesota economy, and explains, I think, a lot of the deep concern that was expressed by the business community in the last session. And finally, labor cost structures, and I emphasize relative to foundational competitiveness, appear to be the state's chief concern. This does not mean cheap labor or low-cost labor. This means the cost of labor relative to the foundational competitiveness issues, and where we saw some potential areas of concern was cost of labor adjusted for educational attainment and workforce productivity. We're closer to the bottom. We're in the bottom half of the nation. We're not experts in this area, but we think it's something that probably deserves a closer investigation by those who are experts in it. We issued this study in January or February of this year, and of course there's a steady stream of new information that comes out, and largely I think the more recent findings sort of affirm a lot of the themes and ideas that we uncovered in the course of our investigation. The Ball State Logistics and Manufacturing Scorecard, again, fantastic grades in many of the areas that they assess, but our tax climate received a failing rank. Beacon Hill State Competitiveness is updated. We're now third nationally, even climbed higher in the rankings in state competitiveness, but again, our lowest ranking is on state fiscal policy, which includes the broad areas of business tax and cost, where we're 39th in the nation. Forbes got a lot of attention recently, noting that we are the 8th best place for business, and a lot of news releases and news reports accompanied that announcement. If you pull back the methodology a little bit, you find that our lowest ranking was on business cost, again, 34th in the nation. So I think this leads to one of the primary balancing questions that we have. None of this stuff is free. They're called investments by many for a very good reason. You have to put money into these sorts of things, like education, like workforce quality, like public infrastructure. And all these things come with a price tag. And I think some would argue that the higher price tag is what we should expect to retain these important foundational advantages that the state of Minnesota has. I think there's something to be said for that, but let me share with you 3 reasons that we came up with as part of our analysis of the data of why tax and cost climate should continue to merit very close attention here in the state of Minnesota. The first reason is that there appears to be a kind of a disconnect between the advantages that we offer and the private sector results that we would expect. For example, again, fantastic ratings in areas of innovation, patents, venture capital, R&D. How does that translate into actual private sector activity? It seems a little more, less exciting, to say the least. 44th in entrepreneurial activity, 26th in independent public offerings, and 29th in foreign direct investment. Again, 12th in STEM job concentration, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We have an incredibly scientifically talented, concentrated workforce here in the Twin Cities, but those jobs do not seem to be growing as fast here as they are in other parts of the nation. We're 37th in STEM job growth. Again, fantastic scores on the workforce quality issues of educational attainment and higher education degree output, but something is not translating quite the way I think we would want to or might expect with respect to private sector activity being 34th in long-term job growth. So it raises a question, what's going on here? And we find this disconnect across all sort of measures of private sector performance, from the activities of Fortune 500 companies down to micro enterprise formation. So the question we pose and investigate is, can a more challenging business tax and cost climate sort of offset the advantages we would expect to be delivered by those sorts of advantages that we do have in the area of foundational competitiveness? The research does suggest that that is possible. Now, research in this area is incredibly complex, and you can find a whole lot of ammunition to argue whatever you want in the area of how these things relate to actual performance. We picked out this study because, for 2 reasons. One, it's a very careful and thoughtful study from a methodological standpoint. Some folks it's from it's published in the National Bureau of Economic Research. It was done by 3 rather distinguished scholars in California who did a very good job of controlling for all the sorts of things that you need to control for in a study of this nature. And they look specifically at various business climate indexes as their measures or predictors of performance. And they found that strong statistical relationships between the tax and cost rankings and in various measures of economic performance. Less so with respect to foundational competitiveness, although new firm creation did show stronger relationships than in the tax to cost area. And that makes some sense, I think. With new firm creation, if you have strong foundational competitiveness with respect to your educated workforce and things of that nature, I think a lot of the organic growth of new enterprises is likely to be fostered by that. They took great pains to suggest that in no way, shape, or form does this study discount the important role of foundational competitiveness investments, but they did conclude that evidence from tax and cost-related climate indexes imply or that concerns are justified in looking at whether or not the cost of doing business can slow down economic growth. We also looked at what the practitioners say. The area development group has done for 26 years a sort of investigation of a survey of practitioners in both site selection and consultants who participate in site selection. And again, we sort of broke it down by the things that they care the most about, identified the 5 foundational competitiveness factors as well as the investment factors. And again, you see that the most important thing is highway accessibility overall, and skilled labor obviously is huge, just as important as labor costs and more so than the tax rate. But as a collection, again, I think you see that the cost side of the ledger matters just a little bit more. Again, not saying that other things aren't important, but there's a weighting issue here. And the way we describe these sorts of findings in our report is that we try to create an agricultural field analogy to this, and that Minnesota has an incredibly ripe and fertile field for economic growth and development here because of all the foundational advantages that we have. But if the economic returns for planting in that field are still better elsewhere, the potential for that field to remain fallow continues to exist. And I think that's a sort of a useful way to think about how to emerge these ideas and confirm these ideas. The second reason that we think that the tax and cost climate issues continues to merit attention is that we likely have a lower margin for error in being a high tax and cost state than other peer states. And this sort of gets to a number of issues, including the whole debate about looking at the universe of performance across the states. Who are the stellar performers? And you'll find that a lot of high tax states actually do extremely well. And many people point that out. And that is certainly true. But there is, in part, a reason for that, I think, that we think is underappreciated and underrecognized. And this gets back to a key issue of competitiveness that Michael Porter talks about with respect to clusters, specifically traded clusters. Michael Porter argues that clusters, which are these sort of interconnected firms and institutions that actually span business types and even can span industries, are essential for strong competitive positioning because the amount of information transfer, skill development, all these sorts of things exist in these clusters that support innovation, idea formation, new business opportunity. And so he places a strong emphasis on looking at the strength of traded clusters as being a predictor of an important role in competitive advantage. The other thing it does is it helps attract and ground firms in place and individuals in place. Silicon Valley, for example, despite having a very, I would argue, one of the harshest tax and cost climate in the country, if you're in the high-tech biz, that's where people are, and you need to be there. The same thing applies to New York, the financial services industry. And when you start to look at traded cluster strength of some of these other high-tax states, you sort of see these sorts of relationships. Maryland, National Institutes of Health, and National Institutes of Standard and Technology, rich areas for the cutting-edge research and in all sorts of areas. You're going to have to be there if you're playing in that field. Massachusetts, obviously, with MIT and Harvard, another place where that grounds firms. California is kind of interesting because once upon a time, 10 years ago, they were 12th in the nation. They have fallen to 30th in their cluster strength, which suggests to us that maybe even their tax system isn't completely impervious to some of these sorts of issues. And then you have the state of Minnesota, which is 39th in our traded cluster strength and 44th on a trend basis. We have a lot of fantastic legacy companies here in the state of Minnesota that provide a tremendous asset base for the state and its economic activity. But the cluster strength seems to be not there. And as a result, as we suggest, it is possible that this is not exactly the place where business has to or wants to be, unlike a lot of other states, which are also our high tax peers. The final reason we argue that the cost and tax climate continues to merit attention gets back to the issue of individual income taxation. Clearly, it's important because the growth and the number of enterprises that run their business income as passed through the personal property tax is substantially higher and growing much faster than the growth of C Corps. But beyond that, we found that economic geographers are reporting that some of the strongest rates of economic growth are occurring where the labor value proposition is the strongest. Remember the slide earlier, labor costs being a big issue? It's reflected here. And as they emphasize, it doesn't mean cheap labor, it doesn't necessarily mean smart labor, but it's where the value proposition goes the furthest. It's a sort of a win-win for both sides. Paychecks go further for employees, and employers get a better value proposition for their compensation dollar. So we took a look at where Minnesota ranks, our statistical area ranks nationally. We found that we're the 13th highest among the 50 largest MSAs in providing equivalent after-tax cost of living adjusted income, 6.6 above the MSA average and 21 to 26% above regional competitors. Just out of curiosity, we asked one of our members to give us the pay scales for their senior scientists. People with no management responsibilities, the type of people sort of absolutely want to build successful business units on, and compared that to Austin operations, and they have to pay 26% more here to provide that same cost of living adjusted, after-tax cost of living adjusted income here than in Texas. That's real money. And when you think of how important labor cost structures are to business location and siting, you can understand why that's an important issue. And as you see in the boxes there, we think that there's a sort of another dimension on this whole individual income tax and labor or cost competitiveness issue that is underappreciated. So much of the discussion here in the state of Minnesota revolves around who's going to leave the state, or if they're going to leave the state. We're looking at the wrong side of the divided highway. We think the competitiveness issue is far more centered around who is excluding us or who won't come as a result of the individual income tax situation and the effect of the individual income tax on attracting highly skilled, in-demand, and highly mobile talent. Similarly, there's a lot of concern about whether business enterprises that run as pass-through entities will leave the state. A lot of discussion, debate about that. I'm sure there's some that will, a lot that won't. But again, we think the other, perhaps larger state competitiveness concern is the effect on having to provide higher pre-tax wages to accommodate for those individual income tax differences and what that means for both labor cost structures and site selection process. So we do think that the individual income tax, there's another story here that deserves consideration. So our primary conclusion is not exactly an earth-shaking one by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it's important to state public goods clearly matter, but so do their tax price. Going back to that Forbes study that just came out where we ranked 8th in the nation, I think the most interesting finding that came out of that for us is who's 7th, and that's Texas. And I bring this up not because they're better than we are, but I think it's fair to say you can't find more polar opposite tax and fiscal policy frameworks than Minnesota and Texas. And you can't find more polar opposite values regarding government and the role of government than Minnesota and Texas. So despite that bipolar existence, they're smunched together among the top 10 in state competitiveness. So what does that tell you? I think it tells us that there are many avenues to competitiveness. There's no such thing as a perfect business climate. You're going to have individuals and firms looking for different things. Some things work for some states, other things work for other states. Both can be successful. In Minnesota, we have clearly embarked and have embarked on a competitiveness strategy that has emphasized high-quality services in significant quantity, and it has undoubtedly served us very well. There's no escaping that conclusion, and I think it can continue to do so. But to maintain that advantage and continue to emphasize that as our primary competitive strategy, this state needs to be relentless in the pursuit of innovation and efficiency and productivity improvements in government service delivery. Otherwise, costs explode, taxes increase, and the climate deteriorates. And the fundamental conclusion is how we tax and spend is just as important as how much we tax and spend. Our recommendations, it was way beyond the scope of the report to get involved in specific recommendations in areas of government spending, but we want to provide a couple of themes to consider going forward. On the spending side is prioritize our foundational competitiveness improvements and carefully evaluate the value proposition to business. Many of you have heard about the three-legged revenue stool that got a lot of attention. So we like to jujitsu these sorts of talking points on occasion. And so we curated the three-legged spending stool of adequacy, priority, and productivity. And we believe there's a lot of discussion going on about the adequacy of revenues for these sorts of programs, but not as much attention that needs to be given to priority and productivity. And if we don't, that stool is also unbalanced and will not stand up in a competitive environment. If Minnesota continues to expect our businesses to support higher tax and cost burdens as the price of our foundational competitiveness, we think the value proposition must be very clear and tangible to Minnesota businesses. And to provide a specific example, I go back to the business-to-business tax suite of proposals that were enacted. There are a lot of reasons with respect to tax policy why these things why the proposals were frowned upon. For tax pyramiding reasons, for instance reasons, for competitiveness reasons, to name the big three. But beyond that, there's the issue of how this money is used. And this money was sort of put in at the last moment to support a broader suite of issues pertaining to property tax relief. And we do not believe, as we say in our report, that that type of thinking passes this value proposition test with respect to the use of business tax dollars. And again, redesign is essential. The productivity mantra, which you hear in certainly the private sector, also has to be applied to public goods and services. And finally, some themes on taxation. I think we strongly suggest approaching tax reform as an investment in a long-term investment in state competitiveness. And what I mean by long-term investment, I don't think anybody would argue that we would spend X percent more on higher education over the course of a year or two and look at the numbers and say, well, that didn't work, we'll try something else. But I think that's where a lot of our mindset is with respect to our tax system. Again, the tax system has the potential to create a very fertile field for business growth and development in the state, and start thinking in terms of long-term productivity and the potential rather than the short-term stimulus ideas with respect to providing various types of incentives and things of that nature to to jumpstart economic activity. We encourage to embrace a Hippocratic oath, do no harm. Turning comparative disadvantages and tax outlier problems is a concern for us. Nobody's going to be number one in everything. You're always going to find something that you're relying on more or less successful with than other states. That in itself doesn't create a problem. It becomes a problem when you turn that disadvantage into a major outlier issue. And that is something that we encourage us to be very careful about. Don't undercut the smart tax policy strategies we have put in place. I don't like being a Debbie Downer about this state. We've done some good things, and it's important to recognize and celebrate those. I can't emphasize enough how the not taxing, we do a lot of work on property taxation. Not taxing personal property for manufacturing commercial enterprises is a big deal, a very big deal. We haven't done it, we don't do it, we never should do it. Let's make sure we continue not to do that. And finally, ensuring business tax revenues, again, obtain a high rate of return on foundational competitiveness. The study is available on our website for any of you who are interested in taking a closer look at it, as well as a lot of other, I think, are very interesting and informative bits of analysis and research that we do. We like to bring out the inner policy wonk in everyone, so I encourage all of you who are so inclined to spend some time on our website and peruse some of the work that we've done, and encourage all of you who are interested in supporting the type of work that we do to consider joining our organization. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to I think we got some time to try to answer any questions, if anybody.
We do.
Representative?
Yeah, I have a question. I've met a few times in recent years with the ICASC group, and they break things down by regional centers. And we meet with them, for example, to Denver specifically. They don't necessarily talk as much state by state as they do Twin Cities metropolitan area and how competitive we are with other major metropolitan areas. And they view Denver apparently as one of our chief competitors.
That's a really good point, and I think that the deeper you go, the more concentrate you go from a geographical assessment standpoint, the better sort of your analysis is going to be. And comparing, statistical areas or regional, I think is a very good thing to do. That was sort of beyond what we were able to do and what the data would provide. The interesting thing I would share about Denver and a couple of these other places is one of the primary findings of this study that I mentioned looking at business climate indexes. Of all the things that demonstrated the strongest relationship to economic performance was the control variable climate. Mountains and Mediterranean climate can make up for a whole lot of sins. And which, I think that points to, again, the potential need for this state to avoid being the cold Omaha and, be very conscientious of the fact that we don't have that going for us. So some of these other lifestyle amenities and things of that nature that at least have a bit of a public sector orientation to them are also important to invest in. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Why don't you control this? I'll just.
Hi. Have you talked about our legacy companies, but also we were low in job growth considering our other benefits. Have you studied whether any of our legacy, if they were to grow, are they growing here or are they growing elsewhere, which would then point to tax policy?
Yeah.
Maybe.
You raised a very important issue, and the quick answer to your question is no, we didn't. There's obviously a number of things we can look at jumping off of this, but it does get, I think, to a very important issue that I think we all should consider in trying to reconcile. We're doing pretty good here, at least compared to the other states right now, and what's going on here. I would argue that economic performance has both a backward-looking dimension and a forward-looking dimension. The backward-looking dimension is sort of the legacy firms that we have here, and the diversity that's created. Our diverse economy has paid benefits for us, but that's a legacy issue. And then the issue is competitiveness going forward, and gets to your question about for those firms that are here, are they keeping their people here? When they expand, are they investing in having the plant here in the state of Minnesota? And I don't have any statistics on that. I have anecdotes from various firms who are members who say we're doing this, we're not doing this, we're never going to do this. The empiricist in me says watch out for anecdotes in terms of generating conclusions from those sorts of things. But I think your point is well taken. It's great to have those firms here. It's even better to have those firms continue to invest in the state of Minnesota, put additional research operations, put additional plant and capacity here in the state of Minnesota on a go-forward basis. And I think that's where some of these competitiveness issues play in. They're unlikely to move, but making sure that their growth also occurs here as well is really important.
Silicon Valley, which is really the heart of the computer industry, they still attract a lot of companies, even though their tax climate is not very good, regulatory climate is not very good. In Minnesota, there's a group of companies that are trying to get Minnesota to become basically the heart of the robotics industry. And a lot of that has to do with STEM and STEM job growth. You indicated that we were pretty low on STEM job growth. So if you were involved in developing this robotics goal, and there's a 2-day conference next month at the River Center in addressing that goal, there's not a whole lot you can do about weather, but what things would you do to sort of improve that STEM job growth model in Minnesota?
I would certainly yield to the STEM employers for their suggestions on this. When we look at the numbers and the relationships or lack thereof that exist, it's suggested to us that for whatever reason, sort of getting to this lady's question earlier, the new plant, the new capacity, the new R&D, the new industries that are spun as satellite-related firms associated with perhaps robotics don't seem to be growing here as well as other places. the 10 years that we looked at captured a very interesting period of time. There may be some reversions to the mean going on. We may be well positioned. I don't know, but you know, I think a look at the tax and cost climate as a potential barrier at least deserves consideration, exploration. But I would certainly yield to the folks who know what their pro formas look like, who do the calculated internal rates of return for investing in new plant, new facility in various areas of the country. Those are the people, that's where the rubber meets the road, and finding out, from them specifically where our opportunities for improvement are would probably be the wisest thing we could do.
Mark, we've got time for one last question here.
Thanks, Mark. I'm glad to see that all the work that we put into STEM and STEP programs in the state of Minnesota are building up that infrastructure. And knowing that there are some world-class programs right here in our own backyard, Blaine High School is one that comes to mind. Baxter Biopharmaceutical came to the state specifically because of, and this is a Fortune 500 company, was your report at all indicated to those new businesses that are STEM-oriented that are coming to the state recently? Because I can't even say this, Mark. Baxter Biopharmaceutical specifically addressed the local regional STEM programs that we have, including the recent development at Northwest Hennepin Community College. So if you could address that, was that part of your research? If not, is there something in the future we could market on this to make it go?
Yeah, firm-specific decisions were beyond the scope of our work. I mean, we took a very macro-level investigation. We do think there are many opportunities to go deeper into these sorts of things. Baxter is a great example. You're absolutely right. If a company values that type of STEM capacity here, that's a fantastic asset for us to market and work with. I suspect, again, that I think, if I can remember correctly, Baxter did have a sweetener associated on the tax side, which suggests to me that, that was also an important consideration with respect to putting plant here in the state of Minnesota. Again, maybe speaking to the importance of not completely dismissing these significant cost and tax climate issues surrounding the state. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for bringing us that insight in Minnesota. And it just came off, but I just want to say the website again was www.fiscalexcellence.org. So if you want to grab the study down and take a closer look at it, some great information. So again, I just want to close up here by thanking our series sponsor, Grand Casino Mille Lacs and Hinckley. Thank you very much. Also AAA Minneapolis, Alana West Health, CenterPoint Energy, Hensing and Snoxel, LTD, Rasmussen, TDS Telecommunications, AVEX, and Comcast. And we really do appreciate your sponsorships. So important to bring in us this. Just a couple upcoming events that I want to highlight for us. We have October 17th. We have an overtime networking event at Regis Office Centers there in St. Louis Park. That's from 4:30 to 6:30. On October 23rd, we have our Leadership Council Happy Hour. Who doesn't love a happy hour? That is at the Park Tavern from 4:30 to 6:30. You can also go to the TwinWest website and look on calendars if you have any questions about this. And then next month, Friday, November 8th, our next legislative breakfast is going to feature Senator Amy Klobuchar, who's going to be here with us. So please be sure to sign up for that one if you're not a series sponsor. That we will reach capacity very quickly for that. So please don't delay that. And just everybody, have a great Friday and an even better weekend. Thank you, everybody.